This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the TV show The Monkees. I have a man who's an expert about that, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is The Monkees, the TV show, as well as the pop band that was created for the television show. Peter Mills is my guest. Before we get into it, I'd like to give him, as I usually do most of my guests, a few minutes to introduce himself. So welcome, Peter. If you could give a little background about who you are, what you do. Are you a music critic? Are you a television critic? And your initial opening thoughts about the Monkees, both the TV show and the band, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Well, yes, my name's Peter Mills. I'm actually an academic. I teach at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. And I teach on the media and cultural studies degrees across the university. But I look after the music courses, really, for the most part, although I teach all sorts of things, film, TV, and so on. So just from that brief description, you can see that the Monkees, kind of overlaps to all those sort of subject areas: music, TV, film, media, advertising, and so on. So that's what I do. I suppose my credentials in terms of, knowing a bit more than you might about the Monkees is that I wrote a book called The Monkees, Head and the 60s, Head being the title of their 1968 film, the one and only film that they made, which was a complete commercial failure at the time, but as is often the case, has acquired a kind of cult momentum subsequently, and is fairly well thought of now. Bob Rafelson, who directed Head, was also one of the leading lights behind, the instigation of the Monkees project per se, and I dare say we'll get onto all that in the conversation.
So let me just open with a question that I don't know if in all the years of my being a kid watching the show or watching interviews, I don't know if anyone's ever really asked, but why was the Monkees spelled with two E's rather than an EY? It was just to be different, like the Beatles with an A?
I think it was the spirit of the age, as you say, the Beatles with an A or the Birds with a Y. There's probably some others that I can't think of at the moment, but that was in order to make it look contemporary, to make it seem like that was a thing that was happening on the pop scene at that particular time. So I'm fairly sure that was it. Yeah.
So most people know the story of the Monkees, the ads being placed in industry newspapers looking for four boys to sort of be what they call the prefab four. Most people, a lot of people, well, I guess some people know that Bob Rafelson was the guy involved, and but a lot of people don't know his relationship, I guess, with Jack Nicholson. Can you give a little background about how the series came to be and Nicholson's involvement with it, especially?
Yeah. Well, as you rightly say, the famous advert looking for Ben Franks types. Ben Franks being sort of an all-night, slightly beatnik, slightly groovy cafe in Hollywood. And it was placed not in the music press, but in the showbiz press, the Daily Variety and the Hollywood Reporter. September the 8th, I think it was, 1965, was when they posted the ad, and it was inviting people to, quote unquote, come down for interview, which had apparently a sort of subcultural connotation. So one of the things I'd say that Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider, his companion, brought to it was that sense of sort of younger people talking to young people, as opposed to TV executives who've been making shows. Well, this is what the kids are going to like. Let's have a mom, let's have a dad, let's have a family unit, let's have a dog, let's have adventures, let's have the extended family in. That kind of recipe for representing the lives of young people on TV. And one of the things that the Monkees was interested in doing was presenting an alternative, possible future for young people. If you think about it, the Monkees, they live in that house on their own, and there's no authority figure. The landlord turns up sometimes to hassle them for money. In the pilot, Here Come the Monkees, which actually wasn't the first episode broadcast, it was about halfway through the first season. They do have a manager who's not mentioned again, but that they sort of got rid of the authority figures. I guess that's the point. And the only authority figure, which is kind of amusing in all sorts of ways, if you think about it in relation to the Monkees, was a tailor's dummy who they call Mr. Schneider. If you watch those the episodes, there's Mr. Schneider sits there, and sometimes they ask him for advice, and sometimes, by golly, he offers it. But he's just sort of sitting there at the table. So there's a little in-joke there, obviously, with Bert Schneider being one of the two head honchos on the project. Just to sort of deal with the obvious thing that gets said still about it is the relationship with the Beatles movies, Hard Day's Night and Help. And of course in Help they have that fantastic house. If you've seen the film, you remember it, and everybody goes through the door and then it's a single space inside. So that idea of a group living together, you could say maybe sort of stemmed from there. But it was part of this, a bit like we were saying about changing the letter in the name, that it was sort of fit with the spirit of the age. It was part of a changing sort of environment, changing kind of cultural landscape, a landscape of possibility for young people. You could go and live with your friends. You didn't have to just sort of stay at home till you got married and then, maybe live in the spare room for a bit until you could afford your own place and so on. It's an exploration of different ways that you could live, really, I think. Idealised, of course, this fabulous beach house in Malibu and so on. It's not given to all of us, is it? But that became like the theatre that their adventures could start from. The Beatle thing, I suppose, came as well through the so-called monkey romps, which you'll see in most episodes, where there's like sort of the high-speed chase. To me, it owes as much to the Keystone Cops as it does A Hard Day's Night. Yeah. But that sort of chasing around, with the songs playing and the comedy element of it. We should say that as well. The Monkees was funny.
To what degree did the show sort of help innovate what came later on MTV with music videos? Because they weren't necessarily precisely what you call music videos, but you could take out the 2 minutes of the song and view it separate from the episode.
Yeah, you could, absolutely, and it would sort of retain some of the energy and the heat-seeking nature of it. The combination of beguiling visuals and catchy pop songs. These were real pop songs. They weren't bogus ersatz approximations. Yeah. They were written by Bobby Hart and Tommy Boyce for the most part, but not exclusively. But it was their songs, the theme from the Monkees, Last Train to Clarksville, gave the Monkees that recognisable sound right at the beginning. Yeah. So I think that one of the secret strengths of the show was the quality of the music. It had all the humour and it had all the fun and the larks and so on, the carry-on business. But it also had the really strong music. So you put those beguiling visuals alongside a genuinely catchy pop song that sounds like 1966 or 67. Sounded like everything else that was in the chart. Then you would. And it's interesting that you mention MTV because in the 1980s, probably people remember, the first major Monkees revival came via MTV. They had a day where I don't think they showed all of them, but the great majority of the episodes they showed on a single day in 1986. And that started the revival, and the three minus Nesmith toured and made an album in 1987, so on and so forth. And of course, Nesmith was instrumental in the creation of MTV in the first place. His channel Pop Clips, which he started up with some help from Jack Holtzman, the guy who owned Elektra Records. Started Pop Clips, which was a 24-hour sort of music video station. And then Nesmith kind of sold that idea to Sony, I believe it was, and they rebranded it MTV. In fact, there's a great clip on YouTube where somebody who works for MTV asks Nesmith about that. And instead of telling the story, says, "Oh, just go and ask your boss." It's very sort of charming.
So I want to talk about the four main individuals, but there's been legends about who applied for the job, who was rejected from it. The two names that come up the most, one is that Stephen Stills applied or went up for one of the roles. I don't know which one, but was rejected. And the other one is that Charles Manson supposedly tried out for it, which seems to have been bogus, I think.
Yeah. Well, to deal with the latter first, that was one of the many sort of stories that have been put out, some say by the Monkees themselves over the years, probably because they just got tired of answering the same question. And Manson was actually in prison at the time of the auditions. Yeah. Although it's well known, of course, isn't it, that he had musical aspirations and sort of befriended, if that's the word, Dennis Wilson, and sort of got a foot in the door that way. But the Stephen Stills story is absolutely true. And he went for what you would call the Peter Tork role. Okay. Because if you think, sort of physically at the time, they were quite similar, you know, sort of blonde, with sort of bowl cut. And what Rafelson actually subsequently described as the Nordic look. He said, "Oh, we wanted the Nordic look." So that was, they were looking for somebody who could do that. And Stills did come down for audition, and there are two versions of why he didn't get it. One a bit more lurid than the other. One is that his teeth were bad because he did a lot of amphetamines. So it's sort of, so he had to have had his teeth fixed, and Columbia Rafelson and Schneider weren't prepared to get his teeth fixed, to pay for him to get his teeth fixed. And then the other story is that, I mean, possibly they're both true, he wanted to do his own songs. He said, "Oh no, I'd have to do my own songs. I'm not singing this, this stuff that somebody else had done somewhere, and we have to front it." So yeah, Manson, phony, Stills, true. And also the other connection is that Stephen Stills and Peter Tork were good friends, and Stills recommended Peter Tork, so they had to track him down. He was washing up. He was a washer-up in the back of a folk cafe, I think, somewhere in Los Angeles.
So Stills was not with the Buffalo Springfield at the time. This would have been 1966?
Just before, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So everybody got their wish. It's win-win. He got to do his own songs with that fabulous group, and got his friend this gig.
Were there any other people that are not known now, or were not well known now, who had applied for it then, or
I only have two. I don't know how well they are to what you'd say a general audience, but to students of that scene at that time, they're probably well known. Brian McLean, who ended up in Love, he auditioned. Maria McKee's half brother, I think we know Maria McKee from Lone Justice, sort of great singer, and Jerry Yester, who ended up joining the Loving Spoonful, who's a folk singer, and another one who found himself in a bit of trouble a few years ago. So he auditioned.
The four that auditioned basically were two guys who were musicians first, and then two people who were actors first. And now you mentioned Mike Nesmith. Nesmith was also a prankster in the sense that he often put out false stories. The most famous one being that the Beatles or that the Monkees outsold the Beatles and the Stones in '67. I think that was
Yeah,
on like an Australian tour.
yeah, and that you see, I would love that to be true, and I'm not entirely convinced that it isn't true. You know, it was said in yeah, I think prank is a good way of putting it, but it's perfectly believable.
Hmm.
You know, that's why it's sort of stuck around, that because it just tells you something about the incandescent stellar success that they had almost immediately. You know, you
Now,
think, oh yeah, that is true. You can believe it.
so Nesmith, I think, was originally from Texas, and he
Yeah,
was more into bluegrass and sort of country music. And he also was, I guess, the son of the person who famously invented liquid paper. So he was sort of, I guess, independently wealthy then. Uh, and given his later refusal to appear on some of the other iterations, it makes you wonder what did he hope to get from it? Just was he in it initially just for the possible fame?
well, I think if you look at his audition, you can see all these things online, of course, now. Um, Another of the secrets of the Monkees episodes, success of them, was that usually at the end there would just be like a little bit. Initially, I think they did it just to sort of fill up time, so the episode was the correct length for broadcast. But they'd have little bits of interviews with the group, so you'd get a kind of a look at the real person.
Yeah.
So one of the amazing things about the Monkees is this slowly developing distinction between the people that we're seeing in the episodes and the people who are doing the concerts and whose faces are on the record sleeves and stuff. Amazing, amazing sort of story all around, really. But Nesmith, if you look at that original audition, he calls himself a failure. He says, "What have you been doing up to now?" Then Mike says, "Well, I've been a failure." And so he took the project absolutely seriously. He didn't view it particularly as a means to an end, I don't think. It was something else that he was up for. It was an opportunity. And Nesmith was kind of became the de facto leader, I suppose, of the group. Although it's hard to tell, a bit like the Beatles, you know, when people say, oh, the Beatles,
Yeah.
John Lennon's group is saying, oh, I don't know, it's to do with all four of them together and something that happened when they're all together. But in some ways, certainly in terms of their struggles with their management and their striving to, you know, have a little bit more control at least over their own, the music that went out with their name on the cover, and so on and so forth. But initially, you know, he was as grateful as the others were, you know, to have got work, to be involved in something that, you know, he could make an actual contribution to. So I think his resistance to join in with the reunions is more to do with the fact that he's had more going on, perhaps subsequently. In a variety of other fields, you know, Pacific Arts Organisation. It kind of made a few movies like Tapeheads, Repo Man, and he funded all sorts of things. His interest in music video, interest, you know, started his own record label, Countryside Records, all sorts of things. So he's often, I mean, the other three have been successful as well, but he was often more involved in the business side, the industry side of it, than, you know, the gigging side of it.
Now,
So it was harder for him to commit to long-term projects like tours, for example.
so was the knit hat that became his sort of signature look? Was that something he came up with, or was that?
Oh
that
yeah,
from
that was his hat.
Okay.
If you look at, as I say, at this original audition that you can see online, he comes into the room wearing that hat. Nobody's told him to wear it.
Okay.
So it was his thing.
Now the other guy who was musician first was Talk, and Talk played, as many sitcoms have, at least here in the U.S., played the dumbest of the four Monkees. But that was supposedly, a sharp contrast from who he was, because he was probably, even maybe more so than Nesmith, from what I've heard, the most serious musician of the four of them.
He was, yeah, he was an extraordinarily gifted musician, and also a grade one intellectual, actually. He was an extraordinarily intelligent, sensitive, intuitive musician and human being, I think. Yeah. And consequently, he felt the blows of show business more acutely than Davy Jones or Mickey Dolenz, who were kind of used to it, having been child stars, and Mike Nesmith, who had this kind of core of steel that allowed him to succeed in show business and move across its various areas. Peter was less able to cope with the brutality of it.
Yeah, and I think you'd mentioned he was from a folk background. And in the 1960s, really, the rise of teen fan magazines really began. Here in the U.S., things like Tiger Beat and Teen Beat, and these were bought by young girls. And the Monkees were always on it, just like the Beatles and some of the other British invasion bands. But Davy Jones was clearly the favorite of that medium. He was also sort of in a little wavelet of British singer-actors who did well on American TV, or tried to. The most famous one that comes to mind is Jack Wilde from Oliver, and then later from Sigmund and the Sea Monsters, a TV morning show. And they were oftentimes, sometimes confused, because they were both short, black-haired British guys. But as you said, Jones came from a musical background, and so and an actor. So he, in a sense, was maybe the most well-rounded of the four of them.
Yeah, and he not to demean the Monkees in any way, but he always saw the Monkees as another role, another part. I mean, he loved it. He was grateful to it. It gave him his a different kind of career. He already had a career, actually, but a different kind of career, so he could do all sorts of different stuff. But yes, the Britishness was a strong currency, wasn't it, at the time? And it's interesting you mentioned Jack Wilde, who had a less happy life, didn't he, than Davy? But they both started out playing the Artful Dodger in Oliver, because Davy did it in London, and then it transferred to Broadway, and he went with the show. So that's how he arrived in America, actually.
Now Davy, though, was basically just a singer, because he really didn't play any instruments. The interesting thing was, while he had some of the Monkees' hits were voiced by Jones, maybe 25-30% with Jones singing the lead. Mickey Dolenz, who was basically just an actor, not any way musically inclined, probably sung on most of the hit songs. He had probably, in a sense, a more memorable voice. He had a kind of raspiness to it that was really perfect for a lot of those songs. And he was a child actor, as you mentioned. I remember as a kid thinking, my dad had grown up, me and him watching the old Bowery Boys films from the 1940s, and I always thought that Mickey Dolenz was the son of Leo Gorcey, an American actor. I don't know if you even know who Leo Gorcey is, but he looked very similar.
I don't know his name.
No. But
I'll look him up.
Yeah, so Dolenz, he wasn't quite as big on the Tiger Beat scene as Davy Jones was, and he didn't play any instruments, but he was cast as the drummer, so I guess he learned to be at least semi-competent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he did have some, as did many young men in that particular era, the early 60s, musical pretensions. He'd been in a group called the Missing Links, which was interesting sort of foreshadow of the idea of the Monkees. And also Rhino, who were kind of responsible for curating the vast archive of unreleased Monkees stuff. They called their series of archival sort of deep dives Missing Links. But he was a guitar player and a singer in the Missing Links, so he had some experience of it. But you're quite right. Oh, I should say that his father was an actor as well. George Dolan's
Yeah.
was
And his daughter was an actress too, Amy
yeah,
Dolan.
absolutely, yeah. So there's a kind of dynasty thing going on, I suppose. But in terms of his singing, as he said, it was brilliant. I mean, they struck gold there, I think, with Mickey's singing. He's a great singer, and as you rightly say, he was perfect for the Monkees material. Had a soulful quality, a kind of youthful urgency to it, which he still retains. Actually, amazing. Did an EP of REM covers last year, which was just brilliant. But had a kind of softness that was sort of approachable. You know, it wasn't like Eric Burdon or Van Morrison where you're thinking, oh, what the hell is that? You know, this kind of barbed wire sound. It was soulful, but it was very approachable and very well suited to their material. And he delivered some of the great pop vocals of the time. I'm a Believer and Pleasant Valley Sunday, just being two of them.
Peter, to keep on Mickey Dolenz, and since this is going to be a show on the television show, more so than the music and that kind of thing, I want to stick with Dolenz because I think it's almost universally acclaimed that Dolenz was the best and the funniest, the most gifted comedian of the four. What is your take on that? And can you rank who is the best actor or whatnot? Because it's often said the prefab four and whatnot, they're kind of dissed as musicians, but I think they were much better actors, and both the show and Head were much better vehicles than the Beatles films. But when it comes to acting, what are your thoughts on the four of them?
Yeah, well, I mean, ranking them would be tricky because, in a way, part of the success of the Monkees is a bit like the success of the Beatles, even though I'm not comparing them. It's the dread comparison that always comes up, is that it required the four of them for it to happen. You know, there was something alchemical. The alchemic, I think, actually is the word. The magical that happened when the four of them were there. But I think I would agree that, well, it's plain, actually, if you watch, that Mickey was the certainly the most physical, brilliant sort of physical comedy, improvisation, very charismatic on screen. I mean, they all were. But I would say that it's probably fair to say that Mickey brought the most out of the four of them to the show in terms of, physical presence. Because he was funny. Didn't even have to do anything. Or he could just raise his eyebrow or something, or cast a look, and that would be funny. And timing too, sort of comic timing. And he's very natural too. It was very important that they were kind of natural because we're supposed to be following these young kids in their aspirational quest to succeed. This is one of the paradoxes of the show as well, of course, is that, in the show, they never succeeded. They were always struggling. The gigs always turned out to be, useless or rubbish or not happen at all, or, they never seemed to sort of get anywhere, but their stoicism and good humour saw them through. Whereas in the quote-unquote real world, outside the show, selling millions of records all over the world and, Monkey Mania and all that. So it's just one of the many ways in which the whole Monkees project is entirely unique, I think, in popular culture.
So let's talk about, you mentioned that the first film show aired later in the first season. The show itself ran for how many episodes and how many seasons?
Well, it's two seasons, or series, as we say in the UK, and 58. I think there were 32 in the first season and 26 in the second.
The 1960s here in the U.S. saw a lot of shows that just lasted, a year or two. I mean, Gilligan's Island was 3 years, Batman was 2 years, the Addams Family, the Munsters, two monster shows only lasted a couple of seasons. That whole high concept era of television, which also was in the UK with shows like The Avengers and The Prisoner and whatnot. There was this meta-ness to a lot of these shows. And the Monkees were certainly like that because the Monkees were one of the few shows that actually broke the fourth wall. It was not something that was done, say, just even 2 or 3 years early in '63 or '64. Was that the first show that did that you know of on American television, or did Batman precede it by a few weeks or months? Or?
I would say that the Monkees, that probably was one of the innovations we can credit the Monkees TV show with having. Certainly in the use that they made of it.
Yeah.
There might have been a little sort of sly reference or kind of a raised eyebrow or a wink or something across the fourth wall in, like you say, in Batman. But in terms of the Monkees, definitely. So you'll see, for example, in one of the episodes, Mickey sort of walking off the set because he doesn't like the script, and knocking on the door, the scriptwriter's room, and he goes in. And in fact, it happens more than once, actually, in more than one episode. In one episode, there are monkeys with typewriters, which, of course, is a reference to the put them in a room long enough and they'll write Shakespeare. Yeah. There's that kind of thing. And then there are other ones where, like, one time it's like an opium den. There's people in very sort of stylized Chinese outfits, kind of old school representation, I suppose. So there's all that kind of stuff, and the audience being addressed very directly by one character or another, one monkey or another. So very definitely, the fourth wall crumbled. In the Monkees. I mean, they didn't just, do it over and over and over again. It was just like a little treat. Mm. And it was another way that people could be beguiled and drawn into the world of this group. It was different. It was different from I Dream of Jeannie,
Yeah. The comedy team that I think most people refer them to, you mentioned the Keystone Cops, but I think most people look to the Marx Brothers because Groucho was almost constantly in the movies, at least at half a dozen times in each of their feature films. He breaks the fourth wall. He'll say something to a woman, and then he'll look at the viewer and say, "Well, that's blah blah blah," and commenting meta. And in that way, I think Dolan's probably broke the fourth wall more than any of the other characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and he was. It's interesting that you mentioned the Marx Brothers, because famously John Lennon said that about the Monkees. He said, "I don't think they're like the Beatles at all. I think they're like the Marx Brothers." Mm. I think Mickey even sort of puts on the kind of the sort of the cipher outfit, the moustache, the nose, and the little plastic glasses several times, doing the cigar chomping thing. That kind of happens several times across the series. So yeah, very definitely. So, and certainly in that that way of sort of reaching out to the audience, coming out of the story for a moment. And it's it happens like Woody Allen's film, The Purple Rose of Cairo. That sort of takes to the absolute limit, doesn't it? The characters come out of the screen and Mia Farrow gets drawn into the story. So yeah, definitely. I think it was innovative in all sorts of ways, and that was one of the big ways.
You said 58 episodes. Can you give me, say, 3 or 4 of the episodes that you think were either the best episodes comedically, or was somehow special in some way? Maybe they did something on their show that was later reflected in later series that had some influence. Are there 3 or 4 episodes that are really standouts that are must see, as they say, for one of the Monkey fans?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of what I tell my students, because I teach a course at the university called Popular Music and the Moving Image, and one of the weeks is on the Monkees. And I just give them a list, and they're easy to find now, these things. So they don't have to devote too much effort to tracking them down. So there are sort of maybe 4 from each series that I refer them to. But if we were saying 2 from each series, and I think you have to, because when you start looking at the series, you can see that straight away that they're very different. The four guys look different. You know, Mickey's hair has grown out into a kind of a super curly bouffant. The hair is longer. Michael often isn't wearing the hat. You know, all that kind of stuff. The clothes are more... They wear the Monkees outfits, the 8-button shirt. Less frequently, you know, they wear kind of what they probably would want to wear in 1967. So in the first series, maybe I would say Monkey versus Machine is good, because it's kind of sort of in a dystopian comedy, if that's possible, where it's about and in some senses, if we want to get scholarly about it for a moment, it sort of anticipates some of the things people said about the Monkees, about the manufactured nature of the group, and what we now call an algorithm. You know, how can we satisfy the need which we can clearly see exists in the marketplace, and using computers to do that. You mentioned The Prisoner earlier on. There's the episode of The Prisoner called I think, is it The General or The Colonel? I think it's probably The General.
Those 1960s, 1970s room-sized computers.
Yeah, that's right. The Speedlearn, which is a bit sort of Orwellian speak, where you could download everything you needed to know about 19th century France in an instant and become an expert. So it was a little bit like that. So it was kind of ahead of the game, but also where a lot of interesting art and culture and ideas were at that time. So that's Monkey versus Machine. One that I always show them because it shows very well something that happened in the Monkees, which was that Rafelson would take a genre, a cinematic genre, and explore it and kind of send it up, but also kind of in the way that Todd Rundgren used to try and recreate records that he loved. Rafelson would try and recreate a spaghetti western. So, for example, Monkees in a Ghost Town is kind of like a spaghetti western. It's got lots of, you know, the kind of the super fast close-ups and cigar chomping, and Mickey Dolenz even wears a sort of Clint Eastwood-style poncho at one point. But also in that same episode, it's a skit on, not so much a skit, a sort of a loving reference back to the westerns, which of course had been, you know, the key genre for so long in Hollywood, certainly in the 1940s, perhaps, and 50s, when Rafelson was learning his trade. But gangster movies, you know, Lon Chaney Jr. plays a heavy, surprise, in that episode. So it's a kind of spaghetti western, but it's a gangster movie, and it's also a Monkees episode. And it's a kind of a road trip. They end up in the ghost town because the car runs out of petrol. So I would say those two are a reasonable selection from the first series. There's an interesting episode which kind of bridges between the series and a rare acknowledgement of the actual success that the Monkees were having, and that's the last episode of the first season. It's called Monkees on Tour, which is sort of a cinema verite documentation of the Monkees' late 66, early 67 tour of the United States. And it's fascinating. There's no narration, you know, no commentary. It just follows what happens to them. That's brilliant. Quite unlike any of the other episodes, really, but is a great sort of documentary piece of documentary filmmaking. You know, the camera doesn't really. There's no narrative interference by the camera or the director. So that's like a little bonus for you. That kind of is between the series. And then the second series, I really like an episode called Monkees Get Out More Dirt, which marks the debut of one of their first, what I call freedom songs in the book. i.e. song that they were able to do for themselves. A song called The Girl That I Knew Somewhere. That's a really great episode. Monkees Get Out More Dirt. Then there's another sort of semi-documentary thing called Monkees in Paris, which is sort of like a sequel to the Monkees on Tour episode from their visit to France, their visit to Paris, on their way to London. I don't think they played a gig in Paris. I might be wrong. I'd have to look that up. But they were on their way to London to play a week's worth of gigs at the old Empire Pool in Wembley. Huge arena. And then also got to mention the very last episode, partly because Mickey Dolenz directed it. Peter Tork also directed one called The Devil and Peter Tork. That's another good one. I'm giving you too many here, aren't I? But the very last one, The Frodis Caper, is like a real freak out episode. It's a really strange half an hour of TV. So much going on, so many ideas pinging about. And incredibly, the last 3 minutes of the very last episode of the Monkees doesn't feature the Monkees at all. It's Tim Buckley singing a song to the siren, sitting on a car, which in a previous episode Michael Nesmith and Frank Zappa had smashed up with huge hammers. And Tim Buckley is sitting on the bonnet of that car, and he's introduced by Mickey Dolenz off camera, and that's the last thing that you see. So that's kind of amazing, really, an amazing finale to the TV series.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the show's style here. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, 90% of American television shows are serialized, and they are, I think, so bad. When you look at episodic television, a lot of people complained years ago about all episodic television, but I think it's the way you do it. The Monkees could not and should not have ever been serialized, and I think the episodic format is perfect for shows like that, or even for Batman, and certainly for Gilligan's Island, which has that Beckett-esque kind of eternal recurrence. I think when you do serialized shows, it makes everything basically a soap opera. And I like soap operas. I like melodrama. I watch soap operas. I'm a fan of some of the soap operas that have been here in the U.S. But not everything should be serialized. How would you describe the show's style comedically? Do you think you view it as avant-garde? Do you view it as sort of nouveau? What is it? The vaudeville, nouveau vaudeville, or something, or something the same. How would you describe the show?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, part of the impact of the humour of the show is that it was new, and it was they weren't speaking the same language as the people in. I haven't seen many episodes of Gilligan's Island. I know it's like a massive thing in America, but I don't know whether it wasn't such a thing in the UK. I should go and have a look at that. But certainly the language they were speaking, but also the disrupted nature of the narratives. You're quite right to say that there's no sense that if it had been serialized, the Monkees in the program would have. There are certain steps you'd have to take the group through, wouldn't you? By the end of the series, they'd have a number one. Hey, we made it. There we go. That's the narrative arc. Yeah. But because they weren't doing that, it was like every time they just had this idea yesterday. There's no reference to what happened last week. Oh, we better not try that because last time we did it, this happened. So there was that sort of sense of innocence about and freshness every time, bouncing back. I'll tell you what it reminds me a little bit of is Laurel and Hardy. You get that from Laurel and Hardy. Every time they're having another go. Oh, now they're selling fish now, so they need a boat. So let's do this thing. Or, we just got to get the piano up these steps. So it's like they were kind of born yesterday in the best possible sense, in a way. So everything's always new, everything's always fresh. So it definitely had that on its side, but also used the term avant-garde, and I think we can go with that because they emerged at a time when the avant-garde and the mainstream were actually bosom buddies. They were hand in hand in cinema, in popular music, very definitely, and why not in TV as well? That is connecting elements of cinema and popular music. Let's put them together on on this new medium and see what happens. And that's what was going on. Could have been a calamitous failure, couldn't it? Famously, the Monkees scored very, very low on the kind of focus group that Columbia TV tried out on, the original episode. And then they went back to Rafelson, he re-edited the episode and added one of these interview bits at the end that I was mentioning earlier on. And then, amazingly, it had a super high rating. So, okay, great, green light, let's do it. And of course, Bert Schneider's uncle, I think it was his uncle rather than his father, I should know that, shouldn't I? Abe Schneider just happened to be president of Columbia at the time, so that's an advantage in getting it sort of green lit.
So let's talk about the demise of the show. You mentioned the last episode. We mentioned two other shows that I put sort of on a continuum because they were basically around the same time. Gilligan's Island started a couple of years before the Monkees. Batman basically ran concurrently. Gilligan's Island was infamously canceled, even though it had great ratings, because the network executive thought it was the dumbest show ever and was embarrassed by it. Batman had a huge, probably even bigger than the Monkees, a huge first season ratings-wise, and then tanked in the second season. Were the Monkees somewhere in between? Why were they canceled?
Well, they were cancelled. It's an extremely good question. Because they were still very popular, but by that point, I think they'd kind of been seen, if you like, to be troublesome and not sufficiently grateful for the success which supposedly had been handed to them on a plate. This was the Bert Schneider thing also, when they kind of fired him as musical director. And wanted to take over their own sort of the reins of their own musical output. That was one of the things he said. Well, why would you do that? What is it that you haven't achieved that you're looking to achieve? So it says something about the wider watershed in popular culture that kind of following your own pathway was seen as more popular than like neo-vaudeville, as you characterised it, just sort of showbiz success. There are other ways you could succeed, and I think that what happened, especially in the second series with the Monkees, was that they were looking to do that, directing their own episodes, very different. The Aphrodis caper is quite frightening, actually. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but if you look at that episode, there's some elements of that which are sort of a bit sort of bad trippy. They are a bit sort of, and certainly for a group whose audience were at least perceived to be the younger sisters of the Beatles fans, sort of 8 to 14 maybe years old. It's a very sort of dark. So I think there was a sense that they'd kind of outgrown the format. There was discussion that the third series of the Monkees, if it had happened, would be something more like what Rowan and Martin's Laughing ended up being.
I just had it on my sheet. I was going to say that the Rowan. It was either going to be that I heard, or sort of like Sherwood Schwartz's other show, other than Gilligan's, the Brady Bunch, where they did the Brady Bunch Comedy Hour or something in the late 70s.
Yeah, that's right. So they felt like it'd been sort of they'd exhausted the format. Yeah. And their interests had gone off in all sorts of other directions, and that's Rafelson as well as in some ways when you're talking about the TV, you're talking about the visuals. Can't talk about the Monkees without also talking about Rafelson.
Yeah, I think the only way it possibly could have worked is the more laughing rather than a variety show, because then you could, in the meta sense, could say, well, they could have it maybe the executives of a network saw the Monkees on their show and then gave them a show themselves or something like that. But by the same token, how long could that really have lasted? I mean, if you're doing a laugh-in show, you need to have. They would have had to have had more, added 4 or 5, main supporting players to
Yeah,
a show.
yeah. No, you would, absolutely. But I mean, they never got the chance to sort of try it out because it was cancelled. I mean, the ratings were falling because the music was changing. Now, you can argue that the music, I prefer the soundtrack to Head and Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn and Jones Limited to more of the Monkees. I think if you were just talking about the records, you would have to say those are better records than the earlier ones. But of course, they sold quite nicely, thank you. But in comparison to the first 2 albums, the later ones, they'd gone off a cliff in a way in terms of sales. So I guess the same thing happened to the ratings in the second series, although still very popular. It was perceived as having already peaked, I suppose, by the executives. So the ruthlessness that I was talking about earlier on of show business, which some of the members of the group were more familiar with and better equipped to deal with than others, was part of the reason for that. The show was cancelled shortly before the movie was released. So very quickly, the cancellation of the TV show, the failure of Head at the box office, at least initially. There was a TV special, we shouldn't forget, around the same time, called 33 1/3 Revolutions per Monkey, which was directed by Jack Good. That was the only thing the Monkees did in that original era which was not directed by, or did not have the substantial involvement of Bob Rafelson, was broadcast against the Oscar ceremony in February, I think it was February or March 1969, by which time Peter Tork had already left. So you can see it was quite a vertiginous drop-off once the TV show was cancelled. We shouldn't forget either that in the 90s, when they reconvened to make the album Just Us and a TV special, the format was they were still living in the house. It wasn't a variety show, and it wasn't a psychedelic deconstruction of fame like you could argue Head was. It was kind of a return to the house on Beechwood Drive.
So we've mentioned Head a few times. It's like you said, the only movie that they made, and I remember for the first time I saw it probably in the late '70s or early '80s, thinking it was better than the Beatles movies. It was certainly much more daring. It moved beyond just the Marx Brothers kind of shtick, if you want to call the television show that, with a little bit of surrealism. This was sort of full-blown surrealism. But it also marked a shift from a different, not only comedic style, but an audio-visual style. But the music, as you said, had changed. The Porpoise song, which opens it when they jump off the bridge, is far more in that psychedelic vein, something like 13th Floor Elevators or something, more than the Beatles. This was, I guess, was it Rafelson trying to reinvent them to keep them relevant? How did that? And what does Head mean? What? I mean, there's the sexual connotation, like they were trying to fuck you for boxing us in or whatever. But what did the title mean even?
Well, the title did have you mentioned Jack Nicholson earlier on, and his involvement. He was a friend of Rafelson's from years before the Monkees, but when they were making Head, when they were planning Head, Rafelson said, "Well, do you want to help me on this picture? Work on this picture." And Jack Nicholson claimed that he'd never heard of the Monkees at the time, I'm sure that's true. Why would you say it otherwise? But it's interesting that the pop world and the acting world could have been so sort of separate that you wouldn't have heard of them. Anyway, so he's kind of scripted the film based on a sort of a lost weekend that they all had together in Ojai in California, and they just had a tape recorder running the whole time. So I think certain substances might have been employed to maximize the imagination at that point. Nicholson sort of converted all these ideas that they had, which might have just sort of been passing thoughts really, that got recorded over this weekend, and came up with this script. Now I managed incredibly to acquire a copy of Nicholson's original script, so there are several scenes which are in that which are not in the movie, and I write about those scenes in the book. But Nicholson's involvement was key, because of course he understood film, and the musical element was another way of demonstrating the change. Now the original working title of Head was Changes, and you asked, it's a very long way around, I'm sorry, you asked me where the title came from, and it was partly a slightly smutty joke, but also it was to do with the idea of the head shop. People wear, you could be described as a head, couldn't you, I think at the time. So sort of the paraphernalia of the counterculture could be acquired at the head shop, and so it was sort of an effort to, I suppose, connect this group who, lest we forget, had been absolutely put through the mincer because of their apparently manufactured nature, and fans of quote-unquote real rock music wouldn't have dreamt of going to see a Monkees film. And also the Monkees' original audience, some of whom I don't think probably would have been allowed to see it, the certification being as it was. There's a murder that you see on the screen, which was actually from the news, from the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of disturbing images and
it's the General Loan, the headshot.
That's it. Yeah. So it's not a cute film, although there are cute bits in it, of course. But it's not the film that you might have expected them to make.
Yeah. So I want to. People always talk about the musical successes to the Monkees, like the prefab boy bands of the '80s and '90s, which a lot of them they answered ads. Even going to something where there was a Puerto Rican, I believe, band called Menudo in the '90s that had a few actors there. But MTV, I think, even did a thing where they tried to get a boy band together, on camera. They made it a reality show in the late '90s or early '00s, I think. But I wanted to talk about a couple of shows that are not as often mentioned. One is mentioned sometimes, the other isn't. The first is the Partridge Family, and we talk about Davy Jones, but being all over Tiger Beat and Teen Beat, and to a lesser extent Mickey Dolenz and the Monkees as a whole. But the Partridge Family was a television show based upon a real family band called the Cowsills, and they were actors mostly. The only actual singers were Shirley Jones and David Cassidy, and David Cassidy became a huge star. I mean, he was rivaling Led Zeppelin in terms of selling out amphitheaters and stadiums. Do you see any lineage between the Monkees and the Partridge Family? The Partridge Family was a more standard sitcom family that just did music, but is there any linkage between those two shows?
Yeah, there very definitely is. And to some senses, the Partridge Family's resemblance to shows that were screened prior to the Monkees, previously, before the Monkees, you could see that as a kind of the industry trying to stabilize, because as we've just mention when we're talking about Head and the kind of the strange kind of final episode of the Monkees TV series. The Monkees finales in the 60s were kind of chaotic, really. They weren't showbiz. That's all, folks. You know, it was ragged and unsatisfactory in all sorts of ways, and certainly not nicely rounded off. So the industry was looking for ways where they could sort of control the cycle all the way through. And I suppose, having a family band based, as you say, on the Cowsills, who I think were contemporaries of the Monkees actually in the 60s, and having that mix of sort of actors and singers and stuff. I mean, Shirley Jones was already a star, wasn't she? She'd been in all sorts of...
She'd won an Oscar for, I think it was Oklahoma.
Yeah, I mean, great actress, really vivacious and beautiful singing voice. And David Cassidy, you're absolutely right, took on the mantle of all of them. Actually, it wasn't just it's a bit like Davy Jones. It was kind of all of them because it was just him.
Yeah.
And also, of course, their records came out on Bell Records, which was the same label, same organisation that had issued the Monkees on Coal Gems. It was just sort of a rebranding. So there's very definitely sort of continuity. So I would think that they were looking for a more reliable, less volatile product that they could sell, and the Partridge Family was a very nice package, which appealed to the range because there were little kids in there, weren't there? The little brothers and sisters. There was Susan Day, very sort of glamorous young woman, and they had the authority figure, who was the manager, I think, rather than their father. Is that right?
Yeah, but to get back to the Monkees, if David Cassidy was sort of like the Davy Jones character, the redhead kid Danny was sort of like Mickey Dolenz. He was the scene stealer.
He was, yeah. It's sort of wisecracking. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'd not thought of that, but that's quite right. So the roles were being sort of filled, but differently.
Yeah. So I wanted to mention one other show that you may not have heard of here. So I was born in 1965, so I grew up during sort of the heyday of the Saturday morning cartoon era here in the U.S. And one of the differences, there was a couple of brothers called Sid and Marty Krofft who did these puppets, giant puppets, people, and every year they would come out with some new show throughout the whole 70s. One of the first was H.R. Puff and Stuff with Jack Wild, as I mentioned. Now, one of the shows they came up with in like 71 or 72 was a show called The Bugaloos, which was a show about flying insects, and there was a pretty girl, there was one black bug, and there were two others, and they were supposedly musicians trying to make it in the bug world or whatnot. So the Monkees actually was repeated throughout the early 1970s here in the U.S. during the Saturday morning, usually around 10 or 11 a.m., a little bit later than the cartoons. But this show, The Bugaloos, came along. Have you ever heard of it or know anything about it?
I don't know. You give me another thing to look up now.
Yeah.
Dan. So that's interesting. But it just occurred to me while you were talking there, we should mention the Archies.
Yeah, that's another one.
Bert Schneider, who, after he was sort of defenestrated from the Monkees project, that was the next thing that he did. And of course, a cartoon isn't going to answer back, is it? We can just put the songs out.
It was live action, the Bugaloos. They were live action. They were dressed up as one was a bee, one was a butterfly, one was a firefly, or something like that. And so the Sid and Marty Krofft did that stuff. I was just wondering. Now they never had anything. I think they had one single release and one album release. The show lasted only 15 episodes or something, and it might have hit number 178 on the pop charts or something like that. Here and gone.
Yeah. The one that you've just reminded me of that I did watch when I was little was the Banana Splits.
Yes, and that was their first success, the Krofft brothers.
Right, and of course they had a great theme tune.
Oh yeah.
And that's been covered a number of times, independent of the show.
Yeah, and yeah, they were also supposedly, I think there was a gorilla, a lion, an
Dog.
elephant, and a dog. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
but so to get back to the Monkees, though,
Mm.
why do you think that the Monkees was a great TV show? My explanation, I think, it was very innovative, and it basically was balls to the walls. It sort of exploded or tried to explode a lot of the cliches of television. Sometimes it succeeded, sometimes it failed. But I think overall it did a lot to move television forward as a medium, especially the sitcom.
Yeah, absolutely it did. And you're right. It was attentive to the rules, which by the mid '60s were starting to become settled and recognisable, and gave you a reference point as to what you didn't want to do.
Mm.
To say, oh, we're going to take that convention, we're going to turn it on its head, or we're going to do the opposite. That we are going to show you backstage, we are going to show you the writers, and then we're even going to send them up or something like that. So it was certainly innovative in all sorts of ways. But for me personally, the success of it is something. I think it was right time, right place. And sometimes you just got to be lucky like that, haven't you? You can do all the planning in the world, but unless it really sort of cuts through and makes a connection with people, it's not going to happen. Um, but I think that it's ironic when people talk about the Monkees being manufactured, and it could have been anybody in all this kind of business. When that's manifestly not true.
Yeah.
It had to be the alchemy of those four people
And how many
together.
dozens or hundreds of people tried out for it and didn't make it?
Yeah,
For
yeah, exactly. And so I think it's something to do with that as kind of a magic thing that you can't quantify, which is common to all success. I think actually, or all enduring success at least. So I think there's that. There's the stuff that you can build in. Okay, we're going to do a kind of a haunted house episode this week, or we're going to do a western episode, or we're going to do a teen birthday party episode, or whatever it was. You can build all that stuff in. But the stuff that you couldn't build in, that did actually sort of happen spontaneously and naturally, was the four of them together. Mm. Now you get that alchemy. You get the stories, the humour, the rhythm, the visual rhythm of it, and these stonkingly good pop songs, real songs by real writers. Put those two together, or put all those elements together, and pow, then you've really got something. And that's what happened. It was like a chemical reaction that succeeded far in expectation far in excess, I should say, of what anybody could have anticipated that was involved in it, even, I would say.
Well, Peter Mills, I want to thank you for spending over an hour speaking about the Monkees, the television show, as well as the band. So thank you for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure.